Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
Mother Nature is a show-off. This is some of her best work, and biologists are desperate to know how she does it. Researchers around the world seek to understand the mechanisms that affect diversity and stability in ecosystems. The goal? Illuminating the key factors that ensure ecosystem function and finding prescriptions for the future sustainability of life on Earth. For the past 20 to 30 years, questions about the role of biological diversity have driven scientific research in new directions. To better understand diversity's significance, ecologists now use a combination of field experiments and theoretical models. They scrutinize the mechanisms involved in the maintenance of diversity, as well as the spread of disease and the nature of intricate species interactions. And they find that hypotheses in ecology, like in any other area of biological science, are testable and the results are instructive. At the Cedar Creek Natural History Area in Minnesota, David Tillman devises a set of controlled experiments to test how biological diversity influences ecosystem function.
We have been studying dynamics of plants and insects in hundreds of plots at Cedar Creek Natural History Area since 1982. And one of our major techniques is just to annually measure, record the abundance of every species in each one of these plots, and then look at what happens through time. And it was actually doing this that we came upon our discovery of the relationship between diversity and stability.
In the late 1980s, he turned a bit of bad luck into an opportunity to learn something. Severe drought ravaged this prairie, but some plots at Cedar Creek bounced right back, prompting Tillman to ask why and how. This was a rare opportunity to test the long-held idea that more diverse systems are more stable, and to reveal some secrets of ecosystem function.
It was the third worst drought in the 150 years of recorded meteorology for Minnesota, a very severe drought. And during that drought, we saw that some of these communities, which happened to contain a large number of plant species, were harmed by it. They had their biomass fall to about half of what it had been beforehand, but other ones had their biomass fall down to a tenth or a twelfth of what it had been. There's a 6 or so fold difference in how they were impacted by drought. And the single best variable at explaining it was the number of species. The more species there were in these plots, the more resistant they were to this major disturbance, the more stable they were.
Thus, Tillman began exploring questions of diversity within ecosystems, taking extensive measurements in the field and applying mathematics and statistical theory.
Mathematics is becoming a very important part of the discipline of ecology. Ecology is a science that has a strong experimental component, a strong observational component, but also an increasingly strong component for mathematical theory, trying to integrate the ideas that we observe in nature and try to understand their implications. And so about half of what I do as a scientist is actually developing mathematical theory, mathematical explanations for the kinds of things we observe, for what controls how ecosystems function, the role of what species are in them, the diversity of the ecosystems, the disturbances they might experience, and so on.
Through this work, Tillman has found that models from economic theory can provide a framework for understanding and characterizing the interrelationships involved in ecosystem function.
The portfolio effect is a phrase that we use to describe why it is that more diverse systems are more stable. And there are a lot of analogies between the human economy and how ecosystems work. Many people know that if you invest in a more broadly diversified portfolio of stock, that it varies less from year to year in its value than if you just choose one or two kinds of stock. And that comes about because you're averaging things which are tending to vary somewhat at random. And when you average more and more things together, it tends to vary less. And because nature always has good and bad years for different species, if you have many species growing together and average their responses, that average of that more diverse portfolio in nature is more stable. It doesn't vary as much. So that's one reason why diversity can affect stability.
Tillman reached this conclusion through meticulous observation and measurement of plant species at Cedar Creek over a period of many years. Each summer, the natural area is his lab.
We did this work in 4 different fields, about 50 plots per field. The plots themselves are 4 by 4 meters in size. To sample the plots, every year we clip a strip of vegetation that is 10 centimeters wide by 3 meters long. So it's a long, narrow strip of vegetation. And the advantage of sampling in that way is that a long, narrow strip will average over the patchiness that you see within a plot. And that allows us to get a quantitative measure of abundances of species.
Tillman and his team crunch the numbers to figure out how the different species interact and how these interactions might keep the ecosystem stable.
It takes about 12 to 15 people helping me do this, about 2 weeks of our time in a summer to clip and then sort all this vegetation of species, pick them up, look at them, identify them, then you have to dry them to get rid of the water that's in them and weigh them. Then you have to enter the data in computers and everything else and analyze it, look at what's happening, and do this year after year after year in several hundred plots.
Tillman's team tests the hypothesis that a more diverse ecosystem is more productive and more stable. Within a designated area, ecologists compare one plot of very few species with another that is more diverse. While all plant species depend on water, nutrients, and the microorganisms that cycle the nutrients in the soil, different species use different kinds and amounts. When an ecosystem experiences a disturbance such as insect blight, fire, or drought, researchers have new opportunities to observe that system's response. Disturbances that remove or reduce the abundance of species from the ecosystem affect nutrient uptake patterns. But when recovery begins, species in the more diverse ecosystem are likely to fill niches left empty by lost species, thus stabilizing the system.
What we saw happening was when one was harmed by a drought, other ones increased. They sort of increased using the resources left unconsumed by the species that was harmed by the drought. Differences among species means that they compensate for each other, that one takes the place of the other one. And if you have this kind of diversity in an ecosystem, it means that when that ecosystem is disturbed, this diversity is almost an insurance policy. Because when one does poorly, the nitrogen or the water that it doesn't take up, something else can take up and grow with. And that kind of compensation basically ensures that the functioning of that system will not be harmed as much as it would have been from a disturbance if there had been fewer species in the system. There's a scientific take-home lesson. That is that we now have discovered the trade-offs among species, the differences among species which allow species to coexist, and we've discovered that those same differences that have allowed 2 or 3 different million species to evolve and coexist on Earth, those same forces also mean that the number of species in an ecosystem influences how it functions, and that systems that are more diverse are more stable, they're more efficient providers of services that humans need from natural ecosystems.
As an ecosystem ecologist, Tillman measures the productivity of diverse plots to better understand stability. But other researchers scrutinize species interactions, seeking a greater understanding of community ecology. In some cases, scientists studying community relationships can uncover clear connections between biological diversity and an increased risk for humans of exposure to disease. At the Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, New York, Rick Ostfeld assesses biological diversity among species in patchy forest environments. He hopes to understand how changes in diversity led to the emergence of Lyme disease in humans in the 1980s. Lyme disease is caused by the bacterium Borrelia burgdorferi. The bacterium is carried by deer ticks, which when infected can transmit the disease to animals they bite. The prevalence of Lyme disease in certain parts of the U.S. is due to increasingly large numbers of the hosts preferred by the bacterium, namely deer and white-footed mice. Human proximity to these environments has dramatically increased their risk of exposure to the infected ticks. Ostfeld suggests that something called the dilution effect should have kept the pathogen in check, lessening human contact.
Well, the dilution effect is the term we use to describe the impact of high diversity in reducing the risk of human exposure to Lyme disease. The way that diversity can be seen as a diluting impact is that the greater the number of non-mouse hosts for ticks that you have in any given environment, the greater your ability to dilute the impact of white-footed mice, this main reservoir for Lyme bacteria.
The case of Lyme disease illustrates how understanding biodiversity can cast a new light on our relationship with the biological systems that sustain us. Thanks to the work of researchers like Rick Ostfeld, it is now commonly accepted that Lyme disease emerged in humans because of habitat destruction and the chain of events that inevitably followed from there.
Our studies actually looked at the effect of forest fragmentation from patches that are about 15 to 20 acres in size down to ones that are less than 1 acre in size. So that's the range in which we were looking at the impact on Lyme disease risk. And over that range, there was a dramatic impact where the Lyme disease risk, the number of infected ticks, increased by a factor of 4 or 5 as you got down below about 2 or 3 acres in size. Essentially, the message is the bigger the forest patch, the better in terms of protecting health.
Through a complex process of counting and measuring changes in animal populations, Ostfeld and his team conclude that the small, patchy forest created for the suburban landscape is the problem. This environment promotes a specific type of interaction between bacteria, ticks, and hosts, an interaction that leads to the increased spread of Lyme disease to the humans who also live there.
So they're actually censusing the animals, and of course to census things like white-footed mice, chipmunks, shrews, and the like, you can't just send them a form and hope to get a good return rate. You have to actually go out into the field, capture them in live traps, so they're captured alive, and then they're given a numbered metal ear tag that actually gives them an identity. So we know each individual, where it was caught, how often it was caught, when it goes into reproductive condition, when it has babies, and when it disappears, which approximates when we think it dies, and how many ticks it has on its body throughout its lifetime. So we actually are gathering as accurate estimates as we can of who exists out in the forest that can possibly supply blood meals to the tick parasite population. We think that the order with which species get lost from these forests actually plays a key role in the ecology of Lyme disease risk, because each species of host plays a unique role in feeding ticks or infecting ticks, in supporting the tick population, such that the loss of certain species is much more important than the loss of other species. Mice play a very key role because they are what we call the natural reservoir for the Lyme spirochete. The ticks pick up a Lyme disease infection by biting a mouse.
A diverse population of animals means the ticks have multiple sources of blood meals, diluting the impact of the infection. When a habitat is damaged, some species start to disappear, while mice proliferate.
They do very well in very small patches of forest. The tick population, as a result, also goes through the roof, and a very high percentage of them become infected and dangerous to people. So what we're finding is that the more alternative non-mouse hosts you have in these communities, the greater the dilution impact.
Ostfeld compiled data from the eastern United States and plotted the number of Lyme disease cases per 100,000 people in 1 year against his measure of species richness among small mammals. For each region analyzed, as species richness increased, the number of Lyme disease cases decreased.
So what that means is that we need to know how these various different host species respond to habitat destruction. And it turns out that the short answer to that question is that white-footed mice love fragmented, disturbed, degraded habitat. And what we're now working on in my lab is understanding exactly what the mechanisms are for this effect and how widespread is this impact of habitat fragmentation on Lyme disease risk.
Rick Ostfeld's study of ecosystem interactions provides a new perspective on biological diversity. His work establishes a direct connection between loss of diversity and a noticeable effect on humans. The emergence of Lyme disease is an example of a byproduct of loss of diversity, a dramatic reduction in something called ecosystem services.
Ecosystem services are things that natural ecological systems, ecosystems, provide for human beings. And they include things like filtering water, purifying the air. Ecosystem services include agricultural ecosystems that provide food for us. It's really never been recognized before that an ecosystem service can be protection of human health against these zoonotic diseases like Lyme disease. And the evidence is starting to become, I think, very strong that, in fact, it does do this in the case of Lyme disease, but also other vector-borne zoonotic diseases, and there are many, many of them. Another interesting thing that our research illustrates, I think, is the importance of understanding the complexity of interactions among species in these ecosystems in order to be able to predict risk of exposure to a disease like Lyme. And if we can predict it, then we can avoid it much more easily.
Ostfeld's conclusions about Lyme disease point to a compelling human interest in biological diversity. And like the work of David Tillman in Minnesota, it also shows that scientists can quantify diversity and use the data to assess complex interactions. Meanwhile, these tasks grow increasingly difficult because by some estimates, 1/5 of Earth's species will be extinct by mid-century. So ecologists race to survey systems, species, and genes, all in an effort to better understand how losses may affect our ability to know and preserve life on Earth.
We do know that extinctions are happening much, much faster than they have happened in the past, and that we're approaching the rates that we've seen in the fossil record that we've called mass extinctions. And that has led some people to call this period that we're living through right now the 6th mass extinction.
It's estimated that the present rate of extinction exceeds anything found in the fossil record over the past 65 million years. Paleontologists have identified several periods characterized as mass extinctions within the past 600 million years. They are known as mass extinctions because researchers identified dramatic spikes in the percentage of families of organisms vanishing from the fossil record within relatively short stretches of time. The most dramatic event occurred 250 million years ago, at the end of the Permian period. But the most recent mass extinction occurred at the end of the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago, when dinosaurs were among the casualties. At the American Museum of Natural History in New York, Eleanor Sterling is the director of the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. She studies distribution patterns of biodiversity in tropical regions of the world in order to identify potential and actual threats to diversity. Sterling admits that the question of species extinction leads to a host of other questions about the number of species on the planet and their ecological function.
Well, one of the problems with estimating extinction rates is that we don't even know how many species we have on Earth today. We've named somewhere between, or somewhere around 1.5 million species, and we don't know how many more there are out in the world. And if you don't even know how many you have, how can you be estimating the extinction rate?
While the loss may be difficult to quantify, there's little question about the primary cause, human behavior. Our actions reduce the likelihood that recovery, like that experienced at Cedar Creek, can happen as it ordinarily would.
Well, previously when, for instance, a natural disaster happened in an area, you would have a hurricane come through and flatten a forest, for instance, or a volcano erupted and completely destroyed the biodiversity that was living in a region. the scale of disaster was generally small enough that there was source seeds or animals that could move into the area. And what we're doing now is increasing the scale of the disturbance such that there is no source for replenishment of some of these areas. Now, the difference between this extinction and previous extinctions is that it's human-driven, and that we have the opportunity actually to stop it because we're driving the extinction by the things that we're doing.
To try to evaluate what extinction means within an ecosystem, ecologists look at how species fill different niches. Is it possible to prioritize among them?
Now, what we talk about as an analogy is, in an airplane, you have lots of rivets in the wing of an airplane. If you lose one of those rivets, that plane can still fly. But if you start to lose lots of those rivets, I personally wouldn't want to get on that airplane. So we actually have no idea at this point what are the final rivets and what are the redundant rivets in a system, and it's very complicated to study communities and to identify the role of any species, and we really don't know when we are part and parcel of the process of removing a species from the system, what effect that's going to have on the system. We do know at this point that we've removed a lot of organisms in many systems and that we're towards the edge of collapse in a number of them. And one of the things that scientists are doing is trying to study the stability of systems through time and trying to understand what is the most important set of criteria for maintaining systems through time. Is it stability? Is it numbers of species?
Some argue we can't really answer questions about extinction without a reliable inventory of all the species that exist on the planet. So researchers catalog Earth's organisms, analyzing morphology and genetic makeup to better understand what species exist in nature and what it might mean to lose them. At the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis, researchers take an integrated approach to questions of species relationships and conservation strategy. More than just a tourist attraction, the garden houses a collection of over 5 million specimens of bryophytes and vascular plants from around the world. Peter Raven is the Botanical Garden's director and one of the foremost advocates for sustainability. Meanwhile, in the garden's Applied Research Department, Jim Miller studies the genetic diversity of plants to help devise sustainable practices for human populations around the world.
It's not the majority of the world's plant species that are at threat. The problem is that we don't have the lists. We don't have the list of what are all the species out there. We don't have the list of which ones are common and which ones are scarce. And we need to get through that very basic inventory exercise. And until we do, we're really working with a pretty blurry set of priorities. Plant taxonomists and the botanists here at the Missouri Botanical Garden use herbarium specimens, which are press-dried plants or pieces of plants that are mounted on a standard-sized piece of acid-free paper with a label that contains information about where they were collected and what they looked like at the time of collection. We assemble all the specimens and we can understand how their morphology varies from place to place, how they're distributed geographically, and the things that we need to know in order to construct a reasonable classification. Those same specimens also serve as the permanent records for material that we collect in the sampling programs, so that if we send a sample to the United States National Cancer Institute to be developed or analyzed for anti-cancer activity, we always have a permanent record here we can go back and look at, and we can look at it again and again and again to confirm its identity or answer questions if they may arise in the future. The kind of studies that the Garden's DNA Bank promotes help improve our understanding of classification of plants, which is of fundamental importance as we think about their conservation biology, as we think about aspects of their basic science. One thought that kicks around in the arena of conservation biology is that we're not going to be able to conserve all of the genetic diversity that's out there. Hence, it's very important to understand relationships, and that genetically very distinct organism probably has a very unique genome and becomes of greater importance to save than one of a particularly speciose group. So we're very concerned with sustainability issues.
Sustainability emerges as the most reasonable means of reconciling the two opposing forces, the basic needs of humans and the long-term viability of the environment we inhabit and rely upon. This is Peter Raven's cause.
The way I like to think about sustainability, in a sense, is like living off the interest in a bank account rather than living off the principal. You could think of it as living off what the world produces rather than digging into and destroying the basic productive sources in the world. Now, if you look at what's happened to the world over the past 50 years, you would find that about a third of the forests that were around 50 years ago have been cut without replacing them. About 20% of the topsoil that was here 50 years ago has been lost. About 20% of the agricultural land that was used 50 years ago has been lost because too much fertilizer has been put on it, or cities have sprawled out over it. The depletion of the ozone layer in the stratosphere, and by the addition of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is the main greenhouse gas that traps heat and is leading us on towards a very rapid episode of global warming, which is underway at the present time. Now, if you add all those things together, you can see that we are not living sustainably at the present time. We could have sustainability as an ideal, but it's not something that we're doing. So we have to find formulas for living sustainably and peacefully with the earth. And in doing that, each and every one of us can make a very real contribution, and one whose mark will be found down through the years and far into the future. It's always worth the effort.
Scientists still don't know what all the pieces are or how they fit together to promote ecosystem function. But they believe we can learn which pieces are most vital and how some complex interactions work. Through the application of rigorous scientific methods of investigation and experimentation, researchers hope to uncover the secrets of ecosystem function. And they hope this knowledge will advance sound decisions, encouraging the maintenance of biological diversity for the future sustainability of life on the planet.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.